Guy de Maupassant. The crime solved by Uncle Boniface. That day, as postman Boniface was leaving the post office, he calculated that his route would be shorter than usual, and his heart swelled with keen joy. He was responsible for all the little villages scattered around Verville, and often, returning home in the evening with a weary, long-striding gait, he felt that his legs had covered a good 40 kilometers. So, he would be able to deliver the mail quickly. He needn't even hurry much and could be home by 3 o'clock. What a blessing! Leaving the village by the Sennemar road, he set about his duties. It was June, the time of greenery and flowers, the true reign of the fields. The postman, in his blue smock and black kepi with a red trim, walked along the narrow field paths between the crops of rapeseed, oats, and wheat, disappearing into the grain up to his shoulders. His head, swaying above the ears, seemed to float on a motionless green expanse, slightly quivering from a gentle breeze. He entered the farmsteads through the gates, shaded by the canopy of beech alleys, addressed the farmer by name. "Good day, compere Chico," and handed him the fresh issue of Le Petit Normand. The farmer would wipe his palm on his trouser leg, take the newspaper, and stuff it into his pocket to read with pleasure after his midday meal. A dog, leaping out from a barrel beneath a gnarled apple tree, would bark furiously and strain at its chain, while the postman, without looking back, would set off again, throwing his long legs forward in a military manner, holding his bag with his left hand and wielding his walking stick with his right, which, much like himself, moved rhythmically and briskly. Having delivered the newspapers and letters in the hamlet of Sennemar, he set off across the fields again to take the mail to the tax collector, who lived in an isolated little house about a kilometer from the town. This tax collector, Monsieur Chapati, was a newcomer, a newlywed who had settled there the previous week. He subscribed to a Parisian newspaper, and postman Boniface, if he had a spare moment, would glance through it before handing it over to the addressee. This time, too, he unbuckled his bag, extracted the newspaper, carefully slipped it out of its wrapper, unfolded it, and began to read as he walked. The front page held little interest for him. He remained indifferent to politics. He invariably skipped the finance section as well, but the crime section captivated him utterly. That day there was an abundance of such news. A report about a murder committed in a certain gamekeeper's lodge agitated him so much that he even stopped in the middle of a clover field to reread the article at his leisure. The details were horrifying. A woodcutter, passing by the lodge in the morning, had discovered spots of blood on the threshold, as if someone had had a nosebleed. The keeper must have slaughtered a rabbit yesterday, he thought. However, drawing closer, he saw that the door was ajar and the bolt was broken. Then the woodcutter, seized with fear, rushed to the village to inform the mayor. The latter took along the rural constable and the schoolteacher, and the four of them proceeded to the scene of the monstrous event. They found the gamekeeper with his throat cut near the hearth, his wife, strangled, lay under the bed, and their 6-year-old daughter had been suffocated between two mattresses. Postman Boniface grew so agitated at the thought of this crime, whose horrifying details his imagination pictured one after another, that he felt weakness in his legs and said aloud, "Good heavens! To think such monsters exist!" He slipped the newspaper back into its wrapper and walked on. Images of that crime still haunted his mind. Soon he reached the dwelling of Monsieur Chapati, opened the garden gate, and headed towards the house. It was a low, single-story building with an attic. For 500 meters around, there were no other dwellings. The postman climbed onto the porch, grabbed the handle, tried to open the door, but found it locked. Then he noticed that the shutters were closed, By all appearances, no one had left the house that day. This worried him, because Monsieur Chapati had been rising fairly early since his arrival. Boniface took out his watch. It was only 10 to 8. He had arrived an hour earlier than usual. Even so, the tax collector was usually up by this hour. Then Uncle Boniface, creeping stealthily as if fearing something, circled the house. He found nothing suspicious, except for the traces of men's boots on the strawberry bed. But, passing under one of the windows, he suddenly froze, petrified with horror. Moans were coming from the house. He drew nearer, stepped over the border of thyme plants, and, listening intently, pressed his ear to the shutter. There was no doubt someone inside was moaning. The postman clearly heard drawn-out, suffering sighs, a kind of gasping, the noise of a struggle. Then the moans grew louder, more frequent, more distinct, and turned into desperate cries. At this, Boniface, no longer doubting that a crime was being committed at that very moment in the tax collector's house, dashed headlong through the garden and raced straight across the fields, through the crops. He ran for a long time, gasping for breath, his bag beating against his sides, until finally he reached the door of the gendarmerie post, breathless, beside himself, utterly exhausted. Brigadier Malodor, armed with a hammer and nails, was mending a broken chair. Gendarme Rodier held the damaged chair between his knees, positioning a nail at the break, while the brigadier, biting his mustache and his eyes bulging with the strain, hammered with all his might, frequently hitting his subordinate's fingers in the process. No sooner did he catch sight of the gendarmes than the postman yelled, "Quick! They're cutting the taxman's throat! Run quick!" The guardians of the law abandoned their work and, raising their heads, stared at him with astonishment and annoyance, as one looks at a man who has interrupted an important task. Boniface, seeing that they were more surprised than alarmed and showed not the slightest haste, repeated, "Faster, faster. The villains are still in the house. I heard the cries myself. Come out quickly." The brigadier dropped his hammer to the ground and inquired, "How do you know about this incident?" The postman replied, "I brought 2 letters and newspaper, but I saw the door was locked and thought the gentleman collector hadn't gotten up yet. Wanted to make sure. I walked around the house and then heard moans as if someone was being strangled or stabbed. Then I ran to you as fast as I could. Do set off quickly." The brigadier, rising, asked, "And couldn't you have rendered assistance yourself?" The postman answered in confusion, "I was afraid I couldn't handle it alone." Then the brigadier, deeming this argument reasonable, said, "Just wait until I put on my uniform. I'll catch up with you." And he disappeared into the post, building together with his subordinate, who took the repaired chair with him. Soon they returned, and all 3 set off at a run towards the scene of the alleged crime. Approaching the house, they slowed their pace as a precaution, and the brigadier drew his revolver. Then they slipped noiselessly into the garden and moved closer to the wall. Not the slightest sign that the intruders had fled was to be seen. The door remained locked, the windows shut. "Haven't gone anywhere," whispered the brigadier. Uncle Boniface, trembling with excitement, led them around the building and pointed to one of the windows. "Right here," he whispered. The brigadier approached the window and pressed his ear to the shutter. The other 2 stared at him intently and waited, ready for anything. He remained motionless for a long time, listening intently. To press his head more tightly against the wooden shutter, he removed his tricorn and clutched it in his right hand. What did he hear? His impassive face showed nothing, but suddenly his mustache twitched, his cheeks wrinkled in soundless laughter, and stepping over the green border, he returned to his companions, who were gazing at him in astonishment. Then he signaled for them to follow him on tiptoe, and passing by the porch, ordered Boniface to slip the newspaper and letters under the door. The postman was perplexed, but obediently carried out the order. "And now, let's be off," said the brigadier. But no sooner were they outside the gate than he turned to the postman, his eyes cheerfully squinting and sparkling, and said mockingly, with a sly grin, "What a rascal you are, I must say." The old man asked, "Why so?" "I heard it, by God, I heard it." The gendarme could no longer contain himself and burst into laughter. He laughed until he cried, gasping for breath, clutching his stomach, bent double, and comically wrinkling his nose. His companions looked on in complete bewilderment. But since he could neither utter a word, nor stop laughing, nor explain what was the matter, he merely made a gesture, that very common, lewd gesture. They still understood nothing. Then the brigadier repeated this gesture several times in a row and nodded towards the still-locked house. At that, the soldier suddenly caught on, and he too was seized by frantic merriment. The old man stood before the lawmen and watched in confusion as they convulsed with laughter. The brigadier finally calmed down a little and, playfully slapping the old man on the stomach, exclaimed, "What a joker! Oh, what a damned joker! I'll never forget until my dying day what crime Uncle Boniface uncovered." The postman stared wide-eyed and repeated, "By God, I heard it." The brigadier was again overcome with laughter, and the soldier, to have a good laugh, sat down on the grass in the roadside ditch. "Ah, you heard it? And do you cut your own wife the same way, you old rogue?" "My wife." Boniface thought for a moment, then replied, "My wife. She yells, and how if I whack her?" "Oh, yes. Then she hollers for the whole neighborhood to hear." "So what? Is Mr. Chapati beating his two?" At this, the brigadier, beside himself with delight, turned him by the shoulders, as if he were a mannequin, and whispered something in his ear that made him utterly dumbfounded. Then the old man muttered thoughtfully, "No, not like that. Not that way. Not like that at all. Mine doesn't even dare open her mouth. I never would have thought. It can't be. Anyone would swear she was being murdered." And embarrassed, ashamed, confused, he trudged off on his way, across the fields, while the brigadier and the gendarmes still laughed and, shouting salty barracks jokes after him, watched his black kepi as it floated away over the serene sea of ears of grain. Ladies and gentlemen, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss new stories. Share your impressions and thoughts in the comments. I will be happy to chat with you.